Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 396. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Miles Davis and John Coltrane, live in Stockholm, 1960. This is a record which was released on Dragon Records, a little Swedish label, which I think is still going. It's part of a series of recordings of the very last tour that Miles and Coltrane did together, much of which has now also been released on a 4 CD set by Columbia called The Last Tour. In terms of what to expect, well, this is one of the very last recordings of Miles Davis and John Coltrane playing together. Two giants of modern jazz bound together in a relationship which was sometimes stormy and lasted just a little under 5 years. That relationship began with Coltrane very much the junior partner. It survived his addiction, his recovery from addiction, his spiritual awakening, and his emergence as a powerful and independent force in jazz. But by this point, in the spring of 1960, this town was no longer big enough for the both of them. The tension underlying this recording dates back to the time when Coltrane, now clean, spiritually awoken, and musically inspired after 6 months with Thelonious Monk, rejoins the Miles Davis group somewhere around Christmas 1957 to replace Sonny Rollins. At this point, Miles was seeking a new sound, free of standard chord progressions, and what he developed would become known as modal jazz, which simplified the skeleton of a composition down to the basic harmonies or modes identified with a single scale. And while Kind of Blue, released in early 1959, is typically held to be Miles's signature statement with respect to modal jazz, its predecessor, Milestones, contains many of the same elements. Coltrane, of course, was highly influenced by Miles's experimentation, with his own work in the next 5 years being very much in the modal vein, up to A Love Supreme and possibly beyond. But he too was exploring his own frontiers, which had begun during his time with Monk. A lot of this was highly technical work. It results in what became known as the sheets of sound approach. Some of this, by Coltrane's own admission, was more technically masterful than it was beautiful. And ultimately, these developments would lead to him being accused of playing anti-jazz. Some of these sounds in their infancy can be heard on some of those Davis records I mentioned, but they're much more prominent on the records that Coltrane was making simultaneously as a leader for Atlantic, particularly the widely acclaimed record Giant Steps. And the tension that was emerging, the uncomfortable truth, was that by the summer of 1959, Coltrane's virtuosity and technique in the tenor was second to none. He's now a major figure in jazz, but he's still a sideman. Miles, of course, was conscious of this. He wanted to retain Coltrane in the band, and so he did what he could. Miles's team helped Coltrane get gigs. They got him a great new contract as a solo artist with Atlantic Records, paid him $7,000 a year. He got a Lincoln Continental. He got ownership of his own master tapes through that deal. But despite all of this, as Lewis Porter, Coltrane's biographer, points out, there was really very little Miles could do to prevent Coltrane from leaving when he could see that people like Bill Evans and Sonny Rollins, and then potentially also Cannonball Adderley, were already making good money leading their own bands, or in Cannonball's case, were just about to. Coltrane's restlessness and his growth was also showing up in their club dates. The Davis band would be booked into gigs to play for about an hour, but Coltrane would play solos of a half hour or more even on a single track. This all comes to a head in the summer of 1959 after a series of gigs in California. Coltrane leaves the band. He recommends Wayne Shorter, but Wayne Shorter is not available, so Miles reaches out to Jimmy Heath, who just got out of jail. Coltrane steps back from performing at this point in the late summer and early fall of that year because he'd had some dental work done. Miles gets gigging with Jimmy Heath, but famously on his return to New York, he's beaten up outside Birdland during an intermission by a New York City police officer. Miles ends up being distracted from his work with the group for a couple of reasons that fall. One is he's dealing with that court case, and the second is that he's now working with Gil Evans on that jazz/classical/folk song mashup, which becomes Sketches of Spain. But as that project wraps up in the early part of 1960, Miles had another engagement coming. He'd agreed with Norman Granz to take his own group on a tour of Northern Europe as part of Norman Granz's branded Jazz at the Philharmonic series. But he couldn't take Jimmy Heath because Jimmy had had new probation conditions assigned. He couldn't go beyond a 50-mile radius of Philadelphia. So, somewhat reluctantly, somewhat in hope, Miles turns to Coltrane, and reluctantly, Coltrane says, yes, okay, Miles, I'll come with you, but he also says, this is the last time. The music on this double album is comprised of two separate concerts on the same night, March 22nd, 1960, at the Concerthuset in Stockholm. It's actually recorded by a musician, the Swedish saxophonist Carl Erik Lindgren, who gets a little bit of help apparently from Swedish radio technicians. Lindgren also on this record interviews Coltrane, and that's an interview which is split between sides 2 and 3. The musicians on here are basically the Kind of Blue lineup with the omissions of Bill Evans, who is off doing his own thing, and Cannonball Adderley. Same. So you've got Davis, you've got Coltrane, you've got Jimmy Cobb on drums, you've got Paul Chambers on bass, and you've got Win Kelly on piano. The very first concert of the tour occurred in Paris, and there Coltrane, it's safe to say, outraged a portion of the crowd with his playing. On every track at every gig on this tour, the solos would go first Miles, then Coltrane, and then Win Kelly. Win Kelly, very traditional hard bop player, quite swinging. Miles, again, experimental, stretching out there, but still very accessible for a contemporary audience. Coltrane was blowing people's minds. If you listen to the Paris recordings, you'll hear him actually being whistled, which is the equivalent of booing. And this was understandable because at this point in the spring of 1960, Coltrane is pretty far out in front of the herd. In a couple of years, he'd play again in Paris in a very similar way, and this time to great acclaim, but right now it's just too early. And the music he's playing is mind-blowing. In Paris, and here on this record as well, you can hear Coltrane using techniques which he's only really hinted at on his Atlantic recordings, heavy experimentation in particular with multiphonics. There are two concerts on here with very similar track lists that are very different, and night to night to night, the band was very, very different, largely because of the mood, well, principally Coltrane and secondarily Davis found themselves in. Sometimes Davis is really stretching, sometimes he's more conventional. Likewise, sometimes Coltrane is breaking every rule he can find, and sometimes he feels a lot more tightly integrated with the band. What is clear is that Coltrane is the star. He's the lightning rod. His solos dominate most of the tracks. Somehow, Coltrane has become the A-lister and Miles is second stringer in Miles' own band. So clearly something's got to give, although during the tour, Miles was still pretty supportive. At one point, he takes the band off stage due to the reaction to Coltrane soloing in Germany. He's doing what he can to keep this mercurial talent in his band, and he wouldn't really recover in terms of his own band's composition for a number of years after Coltrane left. But sure enough, the end was nigh, and it came after the final date on this tour, some 19 days after this recording was made. And now both men are on their own, searching for new personnel to find a new sound, a search which would eventually yield spectacular results for both. Sides 1 and 2 are the first concert, starting with So What, which is, as was typical for Miles, much faster than the studio version. Miles is in absolutely peak form, and Coltrane, at least on this early evening performance, is no fire-breathing, free jazz, avant-garde Jesuit. Instead, this is sweet spot, modal Coltrane, doing his own thing for sure, but still very accessible. The next tune is on Green Dolphin Street, which is the only standard across both LPs. We get some brief but exquisite work from Miles on the mute, but Coltrane here is just inspired. His playing is delicate, it's remarkable. He's like a butterfly or a bird. And then, in a real contrast, Kelly comes in, typically swinging, followed by an arco solo from Chambers. Side 2's performance of All Blues is still quite different from the studio version, but a much more recognizable tempo. And it features a long and notable solo by Coltrane in which he's experimenting at length with what I think is multiphonics, but I'm a layperson, so sax experts, please weigh in. Anyway, the wow factor is high. We then have part 1 of that famous interview, followed by part 2 at the beginning of side 3. We now get to the second performance of the night, which again begins with a fast-paced version of So What. And on this one, Coltrane is really going for it. It's a wilder, much more muscular solo, followed by, somewhat incongruously, a seriously hip and groovy Kelly solo. And from here on in, it's clear that Coltrane is just dancing to his own tune or warming his hands to his own fire. Fran Dance is a track which really, I think, shows him expressing the impatience that his tour mates were seeing in him at the time. And the closing number, Walkin', at least in terms of Coltrane's contribution, is a fascinating, challenging version, one that has all the hallmarks of a man fiddling with the lock, trying to get out. This record, in many ways, serves as an epitaph to a relationship in which Coltrane, originally a wayward but talented musician with potential, responds to Davis's tough love, or maybe Davis's callousness, and emerges as arguably the preeminent jazz virtuoso, well, certainly on the tenor saxophone, of the post-war period. You can also hear it as a document of Coltrane's dilemma. Here he was now playing with people he'd been playing with in some cases for 4 or 5 years, but he was completely out of step with them. He'd spend the next 2 years trying to find musicians who could help bring his own internal vision to life. That's another story, but this is a wonderful record, and for me it's 5 out of 5 stars.